Okay. Stop share. Okay, let's share it again. Okay, we are back. We were talking about the second strand of the Enlightenment philosophy in general, which is the German strand, represented by Kant and Hegel for the most part. And this German idealism or German Enlightenment thought can be represented or presented actually with this idea of expressivism by Charles Taylor and Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin originates the term, actually. Expressivism, it's a portmanteau term, if I may, representing the whole of the German tradition, which is mostly idealistic and also emphasizes cosmological aspects of existence in general or metaphysics. And it was more or less a reaction to the 18th century French and British Enlightenment traditions, because these two traditions are characterized by a heavy emphasis on empiricism, mechanistic philosophy, determinism, atomism, and utilitarian leanings. Empiricism, one of the most important philosophers of the empiricist tradition in the philosophy of knowledge, epistemology, I should say, was David Hume, a British, Scottish person, and he was considered as, maybe sometimes still is the greatest empiricist philosopher, actually. And his idea of causality, for example, is still with us. He says that causality is simply the coexistence of cause and effects. Science is based upon relations of cause and effects, and he defines causality as the association and coexistence, so to speak, of two events, two atomistic events. Whenever we see event A, then we should expect the emergence of event B. What's an event? Event is something that happens, anything that happens, It's raining, if I say, for example, this would be an event. And he argues that knowledge can be achieved through our senses. And in that sense, we can, we have 5 senses, right? I guess. And these 5 senses are the most important tools for us to understand the reality in general. We simply observe, so to speak. We see, we touch, we hear, whatever. So basically, in this line of argument, also causality is considered as constant conjunctions of atomistic events. Whenever event A, then event B, whenever I have my car washed, for example, it rains. Well, logically speaking, this is true, but this is not what David Hume says actually. But anyway, it's a joke. For example, in economics, we have this idea in the quantity theory of money. Remember, ceteris paribus, if there's any increase in the money supply, we should expect an increase in the general price level. So increases in money supply is the most important cause of inflation, ceteris paribus, of course. So this idea of causality is still considered by many scientists throughout the world as the correct methodology. Empiricism. So empiricism is important, and it starts with it's a very old philosophy. There are some important philosophers, such as Berkeley, for example, Bishop Berkeley. And he even says that to exist is to be perceived, something like this. If I don't see you, for example, you don't exist. Huh? No, this is not what he says. For example, some sentient beings should observe, should see, through the senses, 5 senses. Even if, for example, as a critique, he was asked something like this: there's a tree in the middle of nowhere, no one can seize it, etc., etc. He says, yes, you are right, but actually God sees it, so it exists. So something like this. But the idea is very simple, actually. Knowledge can only be attained through observation, perception, sense experience in general. So Hume actually perfected this philosophy, and since Hume, we had this same idea even in philosophy of science. Well, of course, there are criticisms to that this is not our concern right now. And Hume is a representative of the Scottish tradition of the Enlightenment, and Hume is very important. For example, he distinguishes between two forms of statements or sentences or propositions. One is the matter of idea. The other is, I keep forgetting the terms. The matter of ideas and the matter of observation, let's say. Science and knowledge in general should be based upon sense experience, perceptions in general. What he means by matters of ideas is that, it's the purely rationalistic philosophy. If you want to understand something, you should rely your own reason. This is a little different from the Enlightenment emphasis on reason. It specifically says that you should never trust your senses in the process of understanding anything, the world, etc. You should rely on some first principles in Leibniz, for example, which are known to be true in the first place. You don't need to use any kind of empirical observation to make it correct, for example. You know that it's true. Descartes is the most important representative of this tradition, rationalistic tradition. His famous motto, cogito ergo sum. I'm thinking, therefore I am, which means basically clear and distinct knowledge can only be attained through thinking, and thinking alone. You don't need any kind of empirical observation or seeing, hearing, etc. Hume believes that this is full nonsense. And he says even something like this, knowledge should be based upon empirical observation. And take a book in your hand and look at it. If there is no empirical part in that book, you should throw it out. Even you can burn it. So this is a very radical understanding, actually. And even at that time, David Hume's books, all of them actually, were forbidden by the church in England at that time. So he simply rejects any kind of holy books because they don't have any kind of facts. Because he also developed this theorem of the separation of facts and values. The facts and values must be kept different. Facts is about what's going on in the world as based upon our own observations. Values is about should statements. What should I do? Ought to, in general. Remember our own distinction between positive economics and normative economics. This is Humean idea, actually. He says no value statement, ought statement, can be derived from a fact statement, and also no fact statement can be derived from a value statement. So he's a radical empiricist in that regard. We should be based, we should rely on facts. What's a fact? Fact is the collection of events, actually, empirical observation. Every time we look, every time we increase money supply, continue to our own example, if there's an increase in the price level. This is a theory, so it's a fact. Theories must be based upon facts in general, empirical observation, continuing and repeating empirical observation. All ravens are black. This is a famous positivistic example. Whenever we look at a raven, we see that it is black, right? Etc. So it's a fact. In economics also, we love facts in general. This is positive economics, etc., etc. So there's a heavy empiricist emphasis within the Scottish tradition and also French tradition as well. It's also atomistic, atomism as a scientific notion is an important aspect, part and parcel of the modern science, Newtonian understanding of the universe is based upon an atomistic position, atomistic metaphysics, so to speak. Atomistic in the sense that, this atom could be a small object, a small particle, such as atom itself. Atom is a theory, actually, a physical theory, by the way. Atomistic idea is a general metaphysical conception, so to speak. So a planet or a golf ball are all atoms. Remember the 3 laws, Newtonian laws. I keep forgetting them also. The first law is the law of, well, anyway, I'm getting old, it seems so. The law of inertia, and the second law is if there is any force affecting an object, there will be an equal counterforce. That's a bad formulation, but I hope you get the idea. And also this inverse square law thing, the gravity. Gravity is an important concept, maybe the most important concept of Newton's whole physics. And the force of gravity depends on the size of the object and the distance between 2 objects, between Moon and the Earth. Both Moon and Earth, the Earth exerts some forces upon each other, but since the Earth's size is bigger and its force is greater than the force, the gravity that Moon exerts upon the Earth, etc. And this force depends on the distance. As distance increases, the force of gravity will decrease, etc. So that's the basic idea. So we are talking about atoms, not some complex entities. They are like billiard balls, so to speak. In the play of billiards. We say so, right? I don't know anything about playing that game. You hit one ball and it hits another ball, which goes to another ball, etc., etc. So this is the idea of causality. It's mechanistic causality, so mechanicism is important. Again, this is the idea of Descartes. Descartes' philosophy is something like this. He believes that there are 2 substances, the matter and the mind, and there are no interactions between these 2 substances, but the matter works upon mechanistic principles. And even his philosophy is characterized sometimes as the ghost in the machine. Our body is just like the machine, or the car, or whatever, spacecraft, I don't know. And our mind is the pilot, is the driver, whatever. So this is purely mechanistic philosophy. Newtonian science is mechanistic science. Human idea of causality is purely mechanical. This example of billiard balls is actually given by Hume itself, if I'm not mistaken. So this is mechanistic and also deterministic. Whenever X, Y comes after, and this is a necessary relationship. Even if Hume himself rejects such kind of idea, he says that we can never say the necessity, we can never say anything about the necessity of this relationship of causality. Whenever we see X, then it comes Y, but this is not a necessary relationship. Necessity, because cannot be observed, it's a metaphysical term. It has nothing to do with facts. We can only say that we observe the coexistence of two events, so that we can say that there's a causal relationship between these two events. Beyond that, we are not entitled to say anything. It could have been otherwise. So this is the idea of it is related at least to Hume's idea of the riddle of induction, just because so far we have observed that every day the sun rises, doesn't necessarily mean that tomorrow it will rise again, right? Just because every raven that we have observed so far is black doesn't necessarily mean that the next raven that we will observe will be black as well. So in that sense, there's no such thing as necessity or metaphysical necessity, but only empirical causality. So anyway, this determinism is important. Natural laws are deterministic, even if Kant has a similar idea, as I have already mentioned. The laws of nature are deterministic laws, and even physics or Newtonian physics is based upon the idea of determinism. And even today, economics is about determinism, right? Determinism simply means that anything that happened must have a cause. Science is based upon determinism. Whenever we are going to talk about Marx's history, Marx's understanding of history, of course, we are going to return to this issue. Are laws of society deterministic? For example, in the preface, I guess, of Das Kapital, Marx says something like this: the laws of capitalism work with iron necessities. So there is no way of escaping from them. Whatever happened in England will be lived in Germany, because he considers Germany, compares Germany with that of England, economic developments. So he says that famous Latin phrase, "Date fabula narratur," the tale is told of you. It means some people, some German friends say that these developments occurred in England, they are not relevant for Germany, etc. But he says, Marx says, no, you're mistaken. The laws of capitalism works with iron necessities, so whatever happened in England are destined to happen in Germany or in any other parts of the world as well, as capitalism develops. So that's the basic idea of determinism. So even according to Marx, there are some strict laws of history, just like there are some strict laws of nature. So no matter what, these laws work with iron necessities, etc. This is one interpretation, of course. This is what Marx seemed to mean, but there are also some contestants of this against this idea. Anyway, so this empiricism, mechanicism, determinism, atomism, utilitarianism, everything is about utility. Economics is the science of cost and benefit and choice and whatever, that kind of things. The German tradition simply rejects them. They emphasize the importance of the whole itself. We should not be concerned with the atoms, but the whole itself that is formed by the collection of these atoms. This is an important issue in social sciences, for example, even today. What can we say about society? Society is simply the sum of individuals, which is the position of methodological individualism in general. Or is it a whole? What can we say about the causality? the relationship of causality between individual and the society. Does individual affect society? If, can individual, a single individual, change the society, etc.? Or does the causality run from the society to the individual? So this is very important. The idea of totality is one of the most important aspects of Hegel's philosophy, and also it's important in Marx as well. We should look at the whole, the totality itself, instead of focusing on the individual parts, because the sum of individual parts is not simply the totality itself, the whole itself. This is the Aristotelian dictum, actually. The sum, the totality or the whole is something different, something bigger even, than the sum of the individual parts. Society is something different, ontologically speaking, or metaphysically speaking, different from individuals, the sum of individuals. The sum of individuals is just a collection, it's not a society, but society has its own laws, for example, etc. This is the idea of totality. So this is very important. And also there are some cosmological emphases in the German tradition, especially in Hegel. Again, the society and the reality itself, the natural reality itself, cannot be understood simply on the basis of the principles of mechanics and also empiricism. There is a much deeper, so to speak, reality than that we observe. This is an important methodological principle that Marx also believes in. And he says in Capital something like this: the science is not about the appearances, about what we see, what we observe from an empirical point of view. It's about the deeper structures, deeper causal relations, necessary relations. There are some generative mechanisms, so to speak, that create the events or the facts that we observe. So anything that appears could be wrong. This is a Platonic idea, actually. If you remember Platon's idea of knowledge, he says, whatever we see is deceptive, actually. The real reality, so to speak, is the world of forms. That's why it's called idealism, right? Ideas, which cannot be directly observed. So in Marx, of course, rejects these kind of metaphysical ideas, so to speak, or idealism in general. But he argues that still, whatever we observe is created or produced something deeper that we cannot observe. There's this important discussion by Marx about the notion of value. And he says value, he doesn't say this, but as an interpretation, we can say that value is as a metaphysical almost, or ontological notion, which manifests itself or appears as the price. Within the political economy tradition, there's this distinction between the market price and the natural price in Adam Smith, or prices of production in Ricardo and Marx. So price of production are not directly observable because they consider the real cost structure of the production process, whereas the market's price is determined by the interaction between demand and supply, so to speak, or according to Adam Smith, it depends on demand. So they are different. Market price is something that we can observe, but the natural price cannot be observed. Marx even says that behind natural prices are the values. So value is not directly observable. They values in general, the value of a commodity, so to speak, or value as a philosophical notion, as a type, let's say, manifests itself in the form of natural prices. Natural prices are important in the determination of market prices itself. Demand is important, but even the cost structure of the production process is more important in the determination of market price, even in Adam Smith. So this is the idea. When we look at the reality in terms of empirical observations, we may be deceived, actually. Marx has this famous metaphor of being upside down. He says, for example, something like that. In the process of competition, everything is upside down. This metaphor was first, maybe not first, but was used in Marx, again, in the preface or somewhere in Capital. He talks about inverting Hegel. He says Hegel was standing on his head and I inverted him, and now he stands on his feet, philosophically speaking. He mentions, he means by this, I guess, something like this. Hegel was an idealist philosopher, I'm a materialist, etc., etc. But still, this, again, is subject to controversy. We are going to talk about. Anyway, so appearances are deceptive. If you want to understand the real relations, necessary relation, or metaphysical relations, so to speak, metaphysics not in a bad sense, in the sense that positivist thinkers use, but in the sense that was used by Aristotle, for example. Whatever exists, it's about existence. In that sense, it's about ontology, the theory of being, basically. That's the idea. Whatever happens in society could be understood by going deeper. It's another metaphor, of course, deeper than the realm of observations, because observations are deceptive. And the most important criticism, one of the most important criticism that Marx directs to what he calls vulgar economics is exactly this. Vulgar in the sense that vulgar economics, well, it's more or less neoclassical economics. Of course, neoclassical economics did not exist in Marx's time, but today we can say that neoclassical economics is a form of vulgar economics. It's vulgar economics deals with the surface, so to speak. That's why it's called vulgar. In the sense that it is concerned with market prices, for example, but behind market prices, we know that there are prices of production, and even behind them, there is the notion of value, etc., etc. So appearances are deceptive. They're just some kind of manifestations of some deeper realities, deeper structures, deeper generative or causal mechanisms. So that's the basic idea, according to Marx. And vulgar economics is limited by the surface of the reality. But if you want to understand capitalism in a better way, you should go beyond these appearances. This is important. The same idea appears in Hegel, not in terms of political economy, but in terms of metaphysics, as I would say. According to Hegel, for example, everything that happens in the world, in the reality itself, occurs or happens by necessity. Anything that happens, anything at all, works through by necessities. I am here talking about this philosophical mumbo jumbo, which is necessary. Necessary for what? Necessary for the idea or the spirit, as Hegel calls, the ultimate substance, to realize itself. Hegel's philosophy is really complicated, and again, I'm not going to pretend that I can understand Hegel, because I don't usually, but still he's a giant philosopher. You should try to understand this. I hope you are smarter than me so that you can understand when you read him. I don't understand him at all. So the picture about Hegel that I'm going to present in this class is very superficial, I should warn you. So this being, according to Hegel, is a metaphysical being, the ultimate substance, which he calls spirit, Geist in German. And Geist is a form of consciousness. But this form of consciousness, in the beginning, does not know anything about itself. A form of consciousness which is not conscious about itself. Easy, huh? That's why I say I can understand what's going on in the Hegelian philosophy. A form of consciousness which does nothing to know. Which does nothing to know about itself. It doesn't know itself. It doesn't have self-consciousness. Human beings are considered as self-conscious, right? I'm a human being. I know that I'm a human being, etc. And this spirit, in the very beginning, Hegel's philosophy is very interesting in this regard. And in this regard, it can be applied, and it was applied to the course of history. There's a beginning of the history and the end of the history, right? Remember this Japanese guy, the end of history, he talked about in the 1990s. What was his name? Keep forgetting. Anyway, this Japanese guy. Later he changed his views, but he says that there's an end of history, which is capitalism itself. According to Marx, again, the same idea. There's an end to human history, of course, which is communism, the latest stage of human development, just right after socialism, etc. And Hegel says that the end of history is represented by Prussian state in the 19th century, in Hegel's time. I'm coming to that. There's a beginning of history and the end of history. History itself is the course in which this spirit guy realizes itself, realizes that it is spirit, realizes that it is a form of consciousness, it achieves self-consciousness, and it considers itself as a form of consciousness. So that's the end of the history. But in the beginning, it doesn't know anything about itself. It doesn't even know that it can know something. I don't know what I'm saying. So history is the process of self-realization of the spirit itself. So in that sense, within this process, everything that occurs, everything that happens, no matter how small it is or how big it is, must happen by necessity. So the history, whatever happens in the history, in the course of history, happens by necessity. Everything is necessary. There's no room for chance or any kind of randomness. There are no random events in the course of history, in the reality itself. Anything that occurs, and any change actually occurs by necessity. This is very important for Marx as well, because Marx's idea of history is usually presented in the Hegelian way, in the sense that history runs its course by necessity. Everything that happens by necessity. There's no place, there's no room for chance or randomness in the course of history. This is one interpretation. This is really hard to swallow, actually, right? In the modern contemporary, I should say, developments in science, natural sciences, says that randomness is an important part of natural processes and also social processes, right? Basically, even the process of evolution, for example, biological evolution, and also the social evolution, if there is such a thing, of course, is subject to some kind of random changes. There's this idea of some important biologist, evolutionary biologist, punctuated equilibrium. You know, there are both deterministic aspects and random aspects of the evolutionary process in general. You know, there's this idea of bifurcation, some random changes, etc. You know, a superficial example could be, which could be wrong, of course, something like this. Remember the extinction of the dinosaurs? Well, we don't remember that. We infer that some, I don't know, 50 million years ago, they became extinct. One theory is the comet actually hit the Earth, or a giant meteor. I have a hard time to say this every time. This giant comet hit the world, and you know, everything changed in the world. Dinosaurs, I don't know, went hungry, and then they become extinct, etc., etc. So we can ask the question: what if this comet did not hit the world at that time? Maybe evolution would run a different course, right? Instead of us, for example, some descendants of the dinosaurs could sit or could do whatever they do, something like this. So there's an element of chance, there's an element of randomness in the change in the course of history, both natural and social history. But according to Hegel, this could not happen. Hegel's philosophy is a systemic philosophy, sometimes it is said. This is the last great system in the history of philosophy. And so he claims to explain everything at all by his philosophy. It's a cosmological philosophy in that regard, if I'm entitled to say that. So basically, even Hegelian philosophy is based upon what these guys, Taylor and Berlin, calls expressivism. Expressivism is, first of all, a reaction, a critique, a philosophical critique of British and French Enlightenment thought. French Enlightenment thought is, again, mechanistic, empiricist, atomistic, and it's also more radical in terms of society or social change, more radical than both the German and the British traditions, because French tradition, you know, those philosophers, Montesquieu, D'Alembert, Condorcet, Voltaire, etc. Encyclopedians, sometimes encyclopedists, they are called because they try to write an encyclopedia of everything. And they also argued that, you know, if there is something wrong in the society in terms of achieving freedom and perfection and so forth, the society itself could be perfected, and even sometimes force could be necessary. You know, most of them died before the French Revolution, but the French Revolution itself is based upon, from a philosophical perspective, is based upon this Enlightenment, French Enlightenment idea. It's more radical than the other two traditions, and they're accepting the importance of changing the society in a better way, achieving greater freedom for human beings, etc. So you can change the society, you can overthrow the king and even kill the king and establish a new society. And this radical part of the French tradition was taken directly by Marx. Marx also believed that, you know, we should get rid of capitalism, overthrow capitalism, in order for human beings to become free beings in the full sense of the word. What's the meaning of freedom? We are going to discuss it as well. It's more or less, it's another Hegelian idea, or the expressivist idea, I should say, that it refers to a kind of self-realization process. This is an Aristotelian, the beginning, idea. Aristotle believed that there are some developmental potentialities for human beings, for any being actually. This is an important characteristic of Aristotelian metaphysics. And any being is characterized by the potentialities it has. There is this relationship, famous example, relationship between acorn and the oak tree. Any little acorn has the potential to become an oak tree one day, but this potential could not be used by every single acorn. Every human being has the potential to become a full-fledged, so to speak, human being, if he or she realizes his or her own potentialities. Then the real human being, they become. But it doesn't necessarily mean that every single human being will be successful in realizing these potentialities. And this idea is very important for Marx as well, and also for Hegel, but with a different way, because the subject of history here is not single individual or human beings in general, but the spirit itself. So when spirit itself realizes that it's a spirit, it realizes its own potentialities, it becomes a full-fledged spirit, a full-fledged subject of history, a subject that knows what it, or he or she or whatever, does, and also what it is, basically. So this is freedom. And this idea is derived from the German expressivist thought. Anyway, okay, so according to this expressivist tradition, human activity and history should be seen as human self-expression, within which human freedom is given a primary role as the authentic form of this expression. There are some potentialities that human beings has, and actually whatever we call history is nothing but the process in which human beings express themselves, express their own essences, so to speak. There's this difference between essence and the existence, again, a Greek thing, just like the essence is determined or defined with reference to potentialities in Aristotle, and existence is about the empirical positions of individuals and so forth, or any kind of being in the world. So potentia and energia, potentiality and actuality is the distinction in this respect. So basically, human beings try to express their own essences into this world. They project their essences, which is called by Hegel as alienation, and objectification by Marx. So basically, we change in the Marxian philosophy, for example, we change the nature within which we live. And in the meantime, we also change ourselves, because we recognize ourselves in what we create. This is like the idea of a painting. We paint, with one important difference, of course, we paint actually ourselves. That's the basic idea. There's this interesting book about history, Man Makes Himself. Again, forgot the author, who was a very important historian. No, getting old, as I say. This is a good excuse, right? So man makes himself. It's very important. Men being human beings, of course, including both men and women and other beings. I mean, other humanoids, let me say. There's a whole array of human beings, right? Anyway, so basically, history is nothing but we do. But what we do is the way in which we express ourselves. We express, it's very simple. For example, we have an idea about what we are going to do. We are an architect, for example, and we want to build something, some monument, for example, whatever it is. So first we have the design of it, right? And then we try to build it in the reality, we make it real. So this is a form of expression. This is a very simple and mechanistic example, of course, but still everything that we do, both as individuals and as the whole of humanity, is nothing but the expression of human self-essences. And in this process, we come to know ourselves. We come to know also around what there is around us. We come to know the nature, we come to know the society, we come to know ourselves. So there's a dynamic, in that sense, relationship or interaction between nature and human beings. So we change nature, but in this process, we also change ourselves. So we build ourselves, even from the scratch, but not from the scratch, of course. We use our own potentialities, our own potentials, what we are capable of, right? For example, I have the potential to become a famous rock singer, which is a lie. But unfortunately, I could only become a university professor. Well, I think this is better. For me, at least I pretend that it's better for me. So some of our potentials could not be realized, mostly by external circumstances, but even by internal circumstances as well, the Freudian thing and so forth. The psychoanalysis is about these kind of problems. But usually, as a whole, we can say that history is human self-expression, a process in which human beings express themselves. Anyway, so both human activity, anything that human beings do, and history should be seen as human self-expression. Expressivism emphasizes that human action and life is directed towards self-realization in the sense of both the embodiment of the essence in reality, we actually realize our own essences or potentials within the reality by building or producing something. Could be some material form, could have some material form, or immaterial form, such as an artwork, right? Roman, novel, etc. And both the embodiment of the essence in reality and the clarification of human purposes, so that each individual can realize their own essences in a way different from her fellow human beings. So as an individual, I have these potentials. As a member of a human species, I have some human potentials, right? And also I have some personal potential. For example, I may have some talent to sing. Let's continue to our stupid example. I sing very well in the bathroom. Anyway, so my aim is, or should be at least, to realize these kinds of potentialities, and each is different because each individual is endowed with different capacities and potentialities, maybe, right? So basically, this is, this goes to the famous nature and nurture thing, but still there are some elements in terms of potentials that we have. There are some elements of humane, being human, member of the human species, coming from us as being human members of the human species, and also there are some individual differences and so forth. So we both try to realize our own essence, but within this process, throughout this process, we also come to realize what are these potentials are. So we define ourselves. In that sense, we make ourselves in the process of history. I mean, even a human being himself or herself is a kind of an artwork, which is the expression of the artist. But the artist and the artwork is the same in this process. So this is an interesting aspect of this German expressivist thought. So life is itself is guided by human values. Values are important instead of facts and empiricist observation and so forth. Values are important. So human nature, human essence in general, forms a single stream of life, model of a work of art, which no part could be defined in abstraction from the others. So this is a social process. Even if we create our own individuality and our own self, it's a social process. It's a joint work between human being and the society itself. Sometimes society controls our own actions, limit our own actions, and sometimes they allow, society allows these kinds of actions. So there's a certain interaction and even dialogue between the self, between the human being herself, and the society, the social and natural framework, general framework in which we live and we act. So freedom is not simply being free from external constraints. It's not about external limitations, but it's about authentic self-expression, realizing our own potentialities, expressing our own nature or essence. So expressivism has four demands: the unity of human beings as forming an indivisible whole, so that the separation of different levels, life against thought, sentience against rationality, knowledge against will. These are French and German, British ideas. There's this difference between empirical and rational part in the human beings, and life is different from thought. Sentience is different rationality from rationality, knowledge is different, values are different from facts, etc. And second aspiration is freedom. We should be free in the sense that we should realize our own potentials, communion with human beings, cosmopolitan solidarity, and being a part of an indivisible whole, the notion of totality in terms of human beings, species, human species, and communion with nature. This communion, this totality of individual, nature, and society is also important for Marx. So these are important expressivist aspirations, and Marx, we can say that, follows this German expressivist idea, among other things. Again, he tried to reach a synthesis among these three strands of the Enlightenment thought. Enlightenment emphasizes the importance of rationality, reasoning, in terms of knowledge, and also in terms of changing the society, as in the French tradition. And it is also important for human beings to realize, and of course, cosmopolitan solidarity, and the importance of totality,